The FIA spent nearly 2 years defending the future of Formula One. Then Max Verstappen started talking, not casually either. During multiple media sessions this season, Verstappen openly questioned where Formula One was heading with the 2026 regulations. He criticized the growing dependence on active aero systems. He mocked the idea of artificial energy management. At one point, he even compared parts of the future driving style to Mario Kart. And suddenly, the tone inside Formula One changed. Because only days after these comments gained traction across the paddock, FIA officials quietly started discussing flexibility, adjustments, ongoing evaluation, which is interesting because for months the public message had been completely different. The FIA had spent most of 2024 insisting the 2026 package was already the correct direction for the sport. Smaller cars, active aerodynamics, increased electrical deployment, sustainability targets, manufacturer attraction. That was the pitch. Then Miami happened. And what most broadcasts missed was not the criticism itself. Drivers complain all the time. The important detail was how quickly the political response started changing after Verstappen became more direct publicly. That timing matters more than people realize because this is no longer just a technical debate about future cars. Inside the paddock, the concern is becoming much bigger than regulations. Formula the 1st of May have realized its most dominant driver is starting to lose belief in the direction of the sport itself. And if that sounds dramatic, look carefully at the sequence of events. Back in early 2024, the FIA presented the first serious outlines of the 2026 regulations. The objective sounded straightforward: lighter cars, cleaner engines, more efficient energy recovery systems. Better sustainability messaging for manufacturers like Audi entering the grid. Publicly, most teams supported the direction, at least officially. Privately, the conversations were already different. Multiple engineers reportedly questioned whether the electrical deployment targets were realistic for wheel-to-wheel racing. There were concerns about cars running out of battery power too early on straights, concerns about aggressive drag reduction systems destabilizing racecraft. But none of that became a major public issue yet. Then Verstappen started dropping small warnings. Late in 2024, he began describing future Formula One racing as potentially less natural, less instinctive, too dependent on artificial management systems instead of pure driving. At the time, those comments were treated almost like personality quirks, Verstappen being Verstappen, but the criticism kept escalating. By the opening phase of 2025, the FIA still sounded completely committed to the regulations. Officials continued emphasizing sustainability goals and manufacturer interest. Liberty Media pushed the future narrative aggressively. Formula One wanted investors, sponsors, and audiences focused on innovation. Then came the sharper comments. During race weekends this season, Verstappen became noticeably more direct about the direction of Formula One, especially regarding how much drivers may need to manage battery harvesting and active aero adjustments lap by lap under the 2026 package. And then the technical report started surfacing. Specialist media outlets began discussing concerns from engineers about deployment inconsistencies, straight line vulnerability, cars potentially behaving unpredictably depending on battery state during battles. Suddenly, Verstappen no longer sounded isolated. The public version of the story was that the FIA was simply refining regulations naturally during development, but the sequence becomes harder to ignore once you place the timing side by side. Verstappen escalates criticism publicly, technical concerns start leaking privately, the FIA suddenly softens its language, and now an uncomfortable question starts forming inside Formula One. What happens if the sport cannot fully convince its biggest driver that the future product will still feel authentic to race? Because the situation is already becoming larger than one frustrated champion, and there's already a pattern here that Formula One has seen before. Go back to 2022. When porpoising became a serious issue under the ground effect regulations, several drivers raised concerns almost immediately. Mercedes pushed hardest publicly because Lewis Hamilton was visibly struggling physically after races like Baku. The FIA initially resisted major intervention. Teams were divided politically. Red Bull argued Mercedes simply had the wrong setup philosophy, but eventually the FIA stepped in anyway, not because the technical debate suddenly became clearer. The intervention came after the credibility pressure became impossible to ignore publicly. Once the conversation shifted from engineering toward driver safety and legitimacy, the governing body moved. That precedent matters now because the current 2026 discussion is following a strangely similar pattern. Public confidence first, quiet concern underneath, delayed reaction afterward, and Verstappen is sitting directly in the middle of it. The sprint race debate exposed another version of the same tension. Verstappen repeatedly questioned whether sprint weekends were actually improving Formula One competitively. He warned that too many condensed sessions were damaging the natural rhythm of a Grand Prix weekend. Commercially, Formula One ignored the criticism. Sprint weekends expanded anyway because the format produced stronger television numbers and higher promoter interest. But inside the paddock, many drivers privately agreed with parts of Verstappen's criticism, even while avoiding direct confrontation publicly. That detail becomes important here because Verstappen has gradually become something unusual in modern Formula One. Not just the dominant driver, not just the championship benchmark, but potentially the only elite driver consistently willing to criticize the direction of the sport while still sitting at the very top of it. Sebastian Vettel became critical later in his career. Lewis Hamilton became more vocal after years of political battles inside Mercedes and the FIA structure. But Verstappen is doing this during his prime dominance phase. That changes the political equation entirely, and the signs are becoming harder to dismiss. Look at how often Verstappen now references racing outside Formula One. Sim racing, GT programs, endurance racing, Nürburgring ambitions. Even when discussing his future casually, he increasingly talks like someone emotionally preparing for life beyond Formula One instead of building a long term legacy inside it. Inside Red Bull, that creates another layer of uncertainty. Because Red Bull can manage technical decline, they can survive regulation changes. What becomes dangerous is a scenario where Verstappen mentally disconnects from the project itself. Especially now, McLaren is closing performance gaps. Ferrari continues rebuilding aggressively around Leclerc and Hamilton. Mercedes is preparing for the new engine era with enormous investment behind the scenes. Red Bull no longer operates with the same political invulnerability it had 18 months ago. And suddenly, Verstappen's public frustration starts carrying consequences beyond media headlines. Because now the FIA faces a deeper credibility problem. Fans tolerated years of Red Bull dominance because Verstappen still represented something authentic competitively. Even rival fans respected the idea that the benchmark driver was operating at an extraordinary level under stable regulations. But what happens when that same driver openly questions whether the future version of Formula One still deserves the same competitive respect? That is the part people inside the sport are watching carefully, because this may not actually be a fight about active aerodynamics at all. It may be a fight about legitimacy. Formula One has always depended on a very fragile balance. Entertainment on one side, competitive authenticity on the other. Push too hard towards spectacle, and drivers start questioning the integrity of the racing itself. Push too hard toward pure engineering, and the commercial side suffers. The FIA now appears trapped directly between those pressures, and Verstappen may have exposed the contradiction accidentally. The governing body wants sustainability goals, new manufacturers, stronger entertainment products, better overtaking narratives. But the more artificial management systems become integrated into the cars, the more drivers risk feeling disconnected from pure racing instincts. That is why the Mario Kart comparison landed so aggressively across the paddock. Not because it was insulting, because enough people quietly understood what he meant. And once that interpretation started spreading among engineers, journalists, and rival teams, the FIA could no longer treat the criticism like isolated frustration from one driver. Now, the situation becomes politically dangerous because if Formula One's dominant champions start sounding unconvinced about the sport's future direction, fans eventually begin questioning it too. And once you look at the timeline that way, the FIA response starts feeling far less random because the contradiction is difficult to ignore now. For months, officials defended the 2026 package aggressively. Public interviews emphasized innovation, sustainability, manufacturer appeal, technical evolution. The governing body consistently projected confidence that the future regulations were already the correct solution. Then the pressure changed direction, not from social media, not from rival teams, from the one driver currently defining the competitive standard of the entire sport. And almost immediately, the language softened. Suddenly, officials were discussing flexibility, ongoing simulations, potential refinement areas, continued collaboration with teams, which raises an uncomfortable possibility. Maybe the FIA realized the issue was never just technical performance. Maybe the issue was perception. because Formula One can survive criticism from midfield drivers. It can survive fan complaints online. It can even survive team principals attacking each other publicly for entire seasons. What becomes dangerous is when the dominant champion starts questioning whether the future version of Formula One still represents authentic racing. That carries a completely different political weight, and the technical concerns themselves are no longer hypothetical either. Several engineering discussions surrounding the 2026 regulations now focus on deployment inconsistency during wheel to wheel battles. Under certain projections, drivers could experience major variations in available battery energy depending on track position and harvesting cycles. That matters because Formula One drivers operate instinctively at extreme speed. If overtaking starts depending too heavily on artificial energy timing windows instead of natural racecraft, the entire competitive feel of the sport changes. Drivers know it, engineers know it, and Verstappen clearly knows it. The timing becomes even more interesting when you compare Verstappen's behavior now versus earlier championship phases. During the peak Red Bull dominance of 2023, Verstappen sounded emotionally invested, ruthlessly competitive, fully engaged with building the fastest possible system around him. Now the tone feels different. He still drives at an elite level. The performances remain extraordinary, but the language surrounding Formula One itself has become noticeably colder. More detached, more transactional. That shift may be the most important clue in this entire situation, because loyal viewers of the sport will recognize something familiar here. Formula One has seen dominant champions lose emotional connection before. Sebastian Vettel reached that point late at Ferrari. Fernando Alonso reached it during parts of the McLaren Honda era. Even Hamilton occasionally hinted at exhaustion during the final years of the Mercedes dominant cycle. But Verstappen's case feels more dangerous for Formula One politically, because he's still winning. If a declining driver becomes frustrated, the sport absorbs it naturally. If the benchmark driver begins sounding unconvinced while still operating at the highest level, the criticism becomes much harder to dismiss as emotion or excuse making. And that may explain why the FIA reacted faster this time. Not because Verstappen embarrassed them publicly, because his criticism validated concerns that already existed privately across the paddock. That is the hidden layer underneath all of this. The governing body may fear a scenario where Verstappen never officially leaves Formula One, but slowly disengages from promoting belief in the product itself. Publicly present, competitively dominant, emotionally disconnected. For Formula One commercially, that could become worse than retirement, because modern Formula One depends heavily on narrative trust. Fans need to believe the racing still matters competitively. They need to believe the drivers themselves still respect the challenge authentically. Once that perception weakens, the political consequences spread quickly, especially heading into a completely new regulation cycle. Audi arrives soon, Ford deepens involvement with Red Bull. Manufacturers are investing billions into the future image of Formula One. Liberty Media continues expanding aggressively into the American market. Every major stakeholder needs the next era of Formula One to feel credible immediately. And now the sport enters that transition carrying visible uncertainty from its biggest driver, which means the next phase becomes critical. If the FIA continues adjusting the regulations quietly over the next several months, people inside the paddock will notice exactly why. If Verstappen softens his criticism, the political temperature cools instantly. But if the concerns continue escalating publicly, the governing body may face pressure to compromise further before the 2026 era even begins. And that possibility changes the balance of power completely, because this story may ultimately reveal something much larger than regulation disagreements. It may reveal that Formula One still depends more heavily on driver legitimacy than the sport wants to admit publicly. And right now, the driver holding the most legitimacy in the entire grid sounds increasingly unconvinced by the direction Formula One is heading, which means the next few race weekends may matter more than people realize. Because if the tension between Verstappen and the future of Formula One keeps growing, the FIA may discover they are no longer just defending regulations. They are defending the credibility of the sport itself.